Okay, we're ready to start a new chapter in our book. I have to read that backwards. Showers of Grasshoppers. Okay, very good. We are blessed with good children, Abina said as she glanced at her husband. I just wish we could give them a chance to really do something with their lives. We send them to school when we have the money, Danso replied. Well, that's a start, especially for Motumba. But what else can we do? I don't know. Abina had that faraway look in her eye as she was thinking about this. We're Christians, and we must do more. What do you have in mind? Danso stared at his wife. I don't know for sure, she began, but I've been thinking. For one thing, we need to find a church where we can worship, as Cassie's book tells us we must. I've been thinking the same thing, Danso replied. Many husbands might not discuss such things with their wives. But Danso valued his wife's opinion. Besides being a good mother and a hard worker, she was smart. And there's another thing, Abina added. Motumba is growing into a man, and still we don't have a plan for his future. What should we do for him? What do you think? Well, I think it's probably mostly up to him and you to decide. He's a very religious boy. Maybe he would make a good pastor. We should ask him what he's interested in doing. Abina adjusted the wick in the kerosene lamp. Its tiny flickering flames made giant shadows jump and dance in shapes on the smooth clay wall. Abina wasn't used to challenging her husband on such important issues. Making decisions like this was a man's job. Well, I've heard there are Christian secondary schools near the big cities, Danso finally said, but I'm sure they're very expensive. We could never afford them. They say money is not always a problem. Abina was determined that this discussion wouldn't die. Cassie said lots of young men and even boys sell books and Bibles to earn a scholarship there. Maybe we could let him do that for a few years until he can earn enough. He could do that part-time while he helps on the farm. I don't think that's a good idea, Abina said. He's 15 already. If he tries to sell books and work on the farm at the same time, he'll never get out of here. He'll be too tired on the farm. He'll be too tied to the farm. But I need him. We struggle now as it is, and with one less hand to help out, it will be impossible to get the work done. No, it won't. We are dependent on him, but we can get along without him. Grandpa's here, and I can help more. Motumba needs to go to school now. There is so much he needs to learn. If we wait till college to send him for religious training, it will take years for him to catch up. With all we've discovered in the Bible and the book Cassie sold us, we've only scratched the surface of the things God wants to show us. We're learning about baptism and the Sabbath and what really happens to people when they die. She sighed as if the weight of the world were on her shoulders. There's too much at stake here. I have this terrible feeling that time is going to get away from us, that Motumba will end up doing what we have done all our lives. I don't want that for him, do you? No, you're right, Danso finally conceded. He should go now. And Luami? She should have a chance at an education too, Abina said, as she lifted her eyes to meet her husband. She was treading on dangerous ground, trying to do so much in one night. but for some reason she felt she must. Talk of education was important, and Luami had just as much at stake as Motumba. Well, it's different for Luami, Danzo replied. She's a girl. No, that's not different, Abina said. We cannot think that just being a wife and having children will satisfy Luami. She is not interested in those things. Must we let her just kind of dry up and waste her life doing ordinary things simply because it's the way of our people? Ordinary? I think ordinary is just fine. Danso's eyes sparkled. She must have a family some day, Abina. If not now, when? Would you have her go to college and become different from the rest of the women in our tribe? He said these words kind of quickly and without thought. Going to university will not make Luami too good for the rest of us. It will make her a better person. Abina urged home her point. In the end, she will be 10 times the mother she is capable of being now. Well, Danso said she's already had 6 grades of schooling. Isn't that enough? What's wrong with that? Well, nothing's wrong with her, Abina replied, glancing around at the sleeping children. But Luami's already discontent with the things we've been asking her to do thus far. Oh, she's fine, he said bluntly. It's the way it's done in many places. Abina's arguments were losing steam, and her voice grew softer. Babanzugu is not the world, Danso said as he set his jaw. It's not necessary for Luami to have that much education. It's not the way of our people. Abina gave up the argument for now. She had gained something for Motumba, but not for Luami. But there would be more opportunities to do more for Luami later. All the next morning, Danzo, Motumba, and Grandfather Manu continued hoeing the beans in their field. They didn't have that much left to do. The plot of ground was only 2 hectares, about 5 acres in size, but they needed to finish. As Motumba had reminded them before, working among the plants much longer would risk the crop because the blossoms were beginning to appear on the plants. Now and then Grandpa Manu would frown and take a swipe at one of the large grasshoppers feeding on the plants. He said little, but Danzu knew Grandpa was thinking about the plague of locusts that had come to the region when he was a boy. They worked quickly under the shade of their pointed, wide-brimmed leather hats as the sun climbed its way into the sky, now painted a chalky blue. The morning was hot, and biting flies were torture to their bare legs, but they kept up the pace. No one talked, not even about the new book they had bought from Kasi. Motumba tried to keep up with his father and grandfather, but he was less experienced with a hoe. At their speed, he began to fall farther and farther behind. About mid-morning, a group of Motumba's friends came by on the road. Why don't you come down to the river with us for a swim, they called, waving their hands excitedly. Rivulets of dirty sweat ran down Motumba's neck and back. He wanted to go with them in the worst way, but he knew he couldn't. There was so much left to do in the bean field, and it wouldn't be right to leave father and grandfather to do all the work. Play could wait. He must do his part. Nah, I've got to work, he shouted back at them. We've got to get this field done by nightfall. Motumba stared at the long, unfinished rows and then wistfully watched his friends go on their way before he turned back to his work. Grandpa glanced at Motumba some 50 yards behind them and stopped to lean on his hoe. He's a good boy, Danso, not a lazy bone in his body. You should be proud of him. He is at that, Danso agreed, but like he said, the field must be done before dark so we can celebrate Sabbath. There'll be time enough for him to go with his friends next week. Noon finally came, and they took a siesta break to get inside and escape the heat. No one felt like eating much as they lay on their mats, cooling themselves with wide fans made from twisted strands of straw. When they finally went back to the field, the temperature was still high, but the sun was halfway across the western sky and less direct. It was a race against time now. Fortunately, the last few rows of beans were on the western side of the field, so they were able to work in the shade during the late hours of the day. And to their surprise, the weeds seemed more sparse, so they all made better progress than they had hoped. When it became obvious they would finish the task before dark, they all began to relax a bit. Finally, Grandpa paused in his work. We've got only these 2 rows left, Danso. Why don't you let the boy go for a swim? He deserves it, and you know he'd be grateful. Danso straightened up and wiped sweat from his steaming brow. You're right, he said, smiling wearily at his father and glancing across the field at the work they had accomplished. You're kind to think of the boy. Well, I was once a boy myself, and so were you, Grandpa Manu grinned. Motumba, Danso called, finish the last row you're on and take the rest of the afternoon off. Go find your friends and take a dip in the river if you want. You've done enough for today. Motumba straightened up in surprise like a blade of grass after a morning rain shower. Thank you, Papa, and he hurried down the row, finishing the last few plants in record time, and then scampered off to the river. Ah, to be young again, Grandpa sighed as he watched Motumba run. Did we ever run like that, Danso? I'm having a hard time remembering. Danso was surprised at the feeling it gave him to let the boy go. But he smiled too. We did, Papa, and I dare say if you were headed to the river to swim right now, you'd run too. Why don't we then, said Grandpa, winking at Danso. I'd say we go as soon as we're finished here. And Danso grinned. All right, then, I'll race you to the end of the row. And with that, the weeds began flying like jumping grasshoppers on a hot summer's day. The men were tired after a long day in the field. So the swim in the river was refreshing, but best of all was the relief to have the field of beans all weeded as they had hoped. When the cool of the evening descended on the little farm, the men sat down to one of Abina's tasty meals of rice and fufu, and for a treat they all had fish that Motumba had caught that afternoon in the river. The evening sun was setting behind the long row of trees west of the house, and Danso had just asked God's blessing on the meal when Kosi suddenly showed up to everyone's surprise. What a perfect ending to a perfect day, Danso exclaimed, as everyone jumped up and crowded around the young book salesman. They invited him to sit down and eat with them. After a long day on the road, he was only too happy to accept. We've been reading that book you sold us, and it has changed our lives already so much, Danso said with a smile. We've read some surprising things about Bible prophecy and the end of the world and what happens when people die. And we found out that the seventh day of the week is the real rest day God wants Christians to worship on. Luame said excitedly, forgetting that she was supposed to keep quiet when there were guests in the house. This will be our very first Sabbath. Danso smiled at his daughter's enthusiasm, and so did Kosi. It's all so new to us, Danso added, but I wanted to ask you, how can this seventh-day Sabbath thing possibly be right? I know of no one else who does such a thing. So you've discovered the Sabbath, Kosi grinned from ear to ear. That's a good one, but it's quite plain in the Bible, as I'm sure you can see. God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. He asks that we celebrate its holiness with him too. In fact, he commands that we do no work on that day so that we can all rest from our labors. Danzo nodded. It's interesting you should mention that. Just last night, we decided we needed to keep our first Sabbath tomorrow, so we worked hard all day to finish hoeing the beans. Kosi couldn't stop grinning. Well, it looks as if God has provided you with time to get some real rest. What do you say we celebrate it together with God? In fact, according to the Bible, the Sabbath starts on Friday evening when the sun sets. The evening and the morning were the measurement of time when God first created the world, so that's when the Sabbath actually begins. So, the Sabbath is beginning right now? It is, Kosi nodded. Would you like to pray with me now to invite God into your home as it starts? Of course, Danso said, bowing his head, and everyone followed his example as Kosi prayed. It was a simple prayer, designed for this family who was discovering God's truth in all its glory. Danzo and Abina had such a look of peace on their faces. In fact, the whole family felt different this night. Had Kosi made the difference, they all wondered? Or was it something else? Was it maybe the idea of the Sabbath rest that he talked about? Night birds called out to one another as the darkness deepened outside. Abina lit the kerosene lamp, and Danzo took Bible readings for the home down from its shelf on the wall. The list of questions Danzo had for Kosi was almost endless. Grandpa Manu talked some too, but the children just sat and listened. As was the custom in West Africa, the children were taught to listen when visitors came. Abina listened quietly too. She was tired after her long day of work, pounding maize in the wooden mortar, washing clothes on the rocks at the river, making the rice and fufu they ate that night for supper. But she was intrigued by what was being said, and her mind raced ahead of the discussion, and finally she spoke. I was wondering, how many people worship like this every Sabbath day? You mean in this area? Kosi smiled at the innocence of her question. There is a church in Aguara on the road to Binyari. I think there are about 25 members coming regularly. That's the closest church group. It is about 30 miles away. They are Seventh-day Adventists and they worship God on the Sabbath, as your book says. In fact, they come from the same church organization that published the book you're reading. Really? Abina's eyes brightened. There's a whole church of Sabbath worshippers, and they published this book? Well, yes, actually, the group is not even a church yet. It's a company of believers, but they meet every Sabbath. What's a company? A company is a group of worshipers who are too small to have a church building of their own, but they have a pastor who comes every other week. An old elder in the church preaches on the other Sabbaths, and I help sometimes too when I come this way. And they call themselves Seventh-day Adventists, Kosi said. Kind of a complicated name, he laughed. The country of Nigeria has many of these groups. Actually, there are more than 1,000 churches and companies at last count. And the closest church is 30 miles away? I wish we could go there sometime, Abina said wistfully. It's a long way to walk, Kosi nodded, but we could do that, or if you can spare the money, we can ride the bus. Well, we're short on money now, but I really want to see how they worship. Abina glanced at Denso. I'd be willing to walk. That's 30 miles each way, Kosi reminded her. That is quite a ways to walk. Maybe we could leave the children with friends. Luami and Abu would get too tired on that kind of a trip. We can't expect them to walk that far. I want to go too, Luami protested. Don't leave me home. Abina glanced at Luami and then at Denso again. Do you think the children could make it? It would be nothing for Motumba, he said, grinning at his boy. More like a holiday, probably. And I think Luami could make it. It's Abu I'm worried about. I'll carry him strapped to my back like I always do, Abina said confidently. How about next Sabbath? Can we go, take the time off and go and make this trip? The bean plants are starting to blossom, so it will be at least 10 days to 2 weeks before the first beans come on. I think we could spare the time. Are you serious about walking? Kosi said, a little worried. We can make it, Denso replied. How about you, Papa? He asked as he glanced over at Manu. Are you game for this? I may be old, but I still have good legs, he said, grinning. Then it's settled, Danso stated. Kosi shook his head and grinned. All right, then. I'll meet you at the church on Sabbath. Here are the directions. And he scribbled some notes down on a piece of paper and handed it to Danso. And so it was that the light of the gospel came to the home of Danso. Truth was shining where there had once only been spiritual darkness of animism and spirit worship, and the angels struck a melodious chord and sang for joy at the new souls who had come one step closer to heaven. All the next week, the family made plans for the trip to church. Walking 30 miles would be no simple task. But with the crop of beans not yet harvested, there was no money for them to catch rides on the bus. The beans had had their final hoeing, and the blossoms had appeared and then disappeared in just a few days as small bean pods emerged from the blossoms. The family anxiously watched to see if the beans would fill out nicely. The weather was drier than usual, but the beans seemed to be doing okay. I think we might It might be wise for us to carry water from the well to give the plants just a little extra, Danzo told Motumba early one morning as they examined the plants. Motumba's face fell a bit at this announcement, but Danzo was quick to add, "We don't have to do it all in one day, son, but if we get up early in the morning and do a couple of rows before it gets hot, and then a few more rows just before dark, the job won't be bad. That will give the plants a bit more of a boost, don't you think?" Motumba shrugged. "It won't be so bad, I guess, and besides, we have the church trip to look forward to," he said with a grin. Danzo laughed. "That's the spirit, Motumba," and father and son set about hauling buckets of water from the well at the back of the house to the field. By the time Thursday arrived, they had watered the entire field, one row at a time. Late Thursday afternoon, the family left on their trip to the city. With all the things they had to carry, they looked like a family of refugees, carrying enough food for at least 5 days, a large pot to cook in, several large skins of water, and a bundle of clean clothes for everyone. Danzo knew he and Motumba could have made the trip in one day. But with the younger children along, he knew such a thing was impossible. They made progress that afternoon and evening, and by the time they finally stopped to build a campfire and settle in for the night, they had gone quite a distance. How far have we gone?" Abina asked with a heavy sigh as she put some rice into the pot Grandpa Manu had been carrying. "About 15 or 16 kilometers, which is 9 or 10 miles, as nearly as I can estimate. I'm glad we decided to leave today instead of tomorrow." Danzo squatted down beside the fire and put some green grass on the flames to discourage the mosquitoes from coming around. "We'll have a much easier time of it tomorrow for all the effort we've put in today." They all lay down on their sleeping mats. Early that night, in the field beside the road, the stars accented the deep indigo twilight sky, and then the big round moon rose in all its glory. As it began its journey into the heavens, it slowly changed from amber to saffron to pale blue-white. Crickets serenaded them with from their snug hideouts among the bambusa bushes, and nighthawks chirped and whistled on their swooping rounds through the sky. But no one stayed awake long enough to enjoy any of it. In a matter of minutes, everyone was asleep. Early Friday morning, before the sun had turned a violet pink, the family was up again. They ate a quick breakfast of maize kenki, and then they were off again on their trip to the city. They wanted to get a good start before the day got too hot. During the first few hours it was cooler, and they traveled quickly. Luami did much better than anyone expected, and even Abu seemed to enjoy the trip, though he had to remain on Abina's back, where he was tied with a long length of mud cloth. They took a break near noon, and after a well-deserved siesta under a tree, they continued on their way. By the time they arrived in Aguara, late that afternoon, Abina looked exhausted, but she refused to complain. "I wouldn't miss this chance to see fellow believers like us for anything in the world," she exclaimed. They found the Seventh-day Adventist church easy enough and set up camp for the night. I hope this is all right, Danso told his father. We look a lot like squatters with all the baggage we've brought. Sabbath morning arrived, bright and clear, and everyone was up at the crack of dawn. They bathed and dressed in their clean clothes and then ate a hurried breakfast. Before long, Kasi arrived. He greeted them with a smile and then introduced them all to Pastor Kawami and several members who had come also quite a distance. Abina's eyes shone with anticipation as the members settled in for the morning Sabbath school. This is our very first Sabbath in a real church, she whispered to Danso, who was all smiles as he took in their surroundings. They were enjoying a well-deserved rest. Not having to go to the fields to work as they did every other day of the week was a real treat. The children were wide-eyed with anticipation at everything they saw. It was all so new to them. After a few minutes, a man got up and led a brief song service. The songs were like nothing Danzo and Bina had ever heard before, but they did their best to join in with the other members. Such songs as Amazing Grace filled their hearts with peace, and Abina especially liked the words to the song, A Shelter in the Time of Storm. Then they all opened their Bibles to study the Word of God. The subject of the day was baptism, a topic the family had read about in Kosi's book. After a while, a friendly woman who had a big smile came and asked the children if they wanted to go with her for some special activities for the young people. Abina was surprised when Abu agreed to go with Luami. Later, the children told her all about the Bible story the teacher told and the picture role she used to illustrate it. Pastor Kawami preached a stirring message on faithfulness to God in everything we do. He told them that faithfulness meant they should honor his Sabbath, share the good news of salvation with their neighbors, and pay their tithe as a way of giving back to God. He read from Malachi 3 and challenged those who hadn't begun to join in the habit of paying tithe. Then he prayed for all the members gathered in the church and sent them on their way with God's blessing. After church, Danso and Abina were invited along with Kosi to go to the pastor's home to eat a noon meal. They enjoyed a wonderful meal of couscous, rice with beans, and a stew made from yams and guinea fowl eggs. To finish the meal, Pastor Kawami's wife gave them a special treat of fried plantains sweetened with sugarcane juice. After the meal, Pastor Kawami had a chance to get to know Danso and his family a bit better. They talked of many things: the farm, the crops, the weather. Pastor Kawami then told them about how the gospel message was going to all the world with the help of the radio. He turned his radio on at 3 o'clock that afternoon so they could hear a radio program called The Voice of Prophecy. There was beautiful music, and poems were recited, and a man with a deep voice spoke encouraging words from the Bible. I've been thinking of what you talked about in church today about tithing. Danso finally said, "We've read some Bible verses about it in a book Kosi sold us. The book says we should pay 10% of our increase, but we make very little on our farm. If we give 10%, we'll have even less. Does God really expect us to pay tithe when we're so poor?" He does, Pastor Kawami said, nodding solemnly. He gives us so much, and tithing is just one way for us to say thank you for his blessings. In fact, the verses we read today at church challenge us to test God. Let's read it again. It's in Malachi 3, verses 10 and 11. Pastor Kawami and Kosi found the spot and held their Bibles so Danzo and Grandpa Manu could read along. Bring all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and try me now in this, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you such blessing that there will not be room enough to receive it. And I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, so that he will not destroy the fruit of your ground, nor shall the vine fail to bear fruit for you in the field, says the Lord of hosts. That sounds pretty clear, doesn't it? Pastor Kawami looked up from his Bible. God sends the rain and sunshine to make your crops grow. He's given you a wonderful wife, smart, healthy children, and a happy home. He even brought the good news of the gospel to your door. Don't you think paying anything less than a full 10% of your increase would be an insult to him? It seems so, Danzo said quietly. He shrugged and glanced at Abina. I guess there's no question about what we should do then. When our crop is sold, we must set aside 1/10 of the money we get. Who shall we give it to? You can bring it to the church here if you like. Pastor Kawami nodded matter-of-factly. The money is used to support the ministry and spread the gospel so Jesus can come again soon. That's good enough for me, Grandpa Manu exclaimed. If it supports projects such as Kosi selling his good books, I'm for it. Are we supposed to pay tithe only at harvest time? Motumba asked. He had been quiet all during the discussion, but now he spoke up, and his insight impressed the preacher. Well, that depends on your circumstances, Pastor Kawami said. Some people pay once a week or once a month, depending on when they get paid for work. Some people pay their tithe when they are given money for something they sell or when the crops come in. If we have money right now that we haven't paid tithe on, should we do that? Pastor Kawami smiled at this mature lad who was already way ahead of the game. Instead of trying to do the least he possibly could in fulfilling one of God's requirements, it appeared he was thinking they should go the extra mile. Motumba, that is exactly what God would have you do, he said reverently, and I'm glad you see things that way. God has a place in his work for young men who will look for chances to honor him and his church. Motumba bowed his head respectfully at these kind words, but Danzo and Abina glanced at each other perceptively. Maybe their dreams for Motumba's schooling would have a chance after all. Danzo paid his very first tithe in answer to Pastor Kawama's challenge. It was a test of faith, to be sure. Danzo had brought only 750 nari with him on the trip, and to part with 75 nari's worth of hard-earned coins seemed a stretch for his faith. God will bless you far and above what you think you may be giving up now, Pastor Kawami assured him. You can't outgive God. The Sabbath ended a few hours later in a blaze of glory as the golden sun quickly dipped behind the horizon to the west. They sang a hymn and then listened as Pastor Kwame repeated a portion of Psalm 19, one of his favorite chapters from David's songs. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. In the heavens he has pitched a tent for the sun, which is like a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, like a champion rejoicing to run his course. It rises at one end of the heavens and makes its circuit to the other. Nothing is deprived of its warmth. Verses 1 through 6, TNIV. Whatever T means, but NIV is, of course, the version. They all retired early that night. Morning would come all too soon. The trip home the next day would be long, and they needed their rest. As they fell asleep under the stars again, they knew the journey had been successful. They had met with like believers, and they had enjoyed the sweet fellowship that comes with worshiping in God's house. They had also discovered the truth about tithing. It was a new idea to them, but they had no way of knowing just how much of an impact it was going to have on their lives. The trip home was uneventful. The weather was cooler thanks to some cloud cover, and it even rained during the late afternoon. Everyone grew weary by the end of the day, and when the family stopped short of home just after sunset, Luami and Abu fell asleep without even eating. Grandpa Manu built a fire and Abina heated up some rice. Everyone ate quickly because they were all eager to lie down on their sleeping mats. It was good to visit the church in Aguara, Danzo said wearily, but I'll be glad to get back home. Everyone agreed, even Abina. By mid-morning the next day, they were home again. Little Abu was overjoyed to be in familiar surroundings, and he ran around and around the house, shouting excitedly. Luami soon resumed her favorite game, catching frogs and worms and grasshoppers. Abina had to call her several times impatiently to help around the house. I was looking for Goliath, Luami protested. He got away. Well, I'm not sure I'm sorry, said Mother. You spend too much fussing around with that bug. It's not a bug, Mother. It's a grasshopper. Actually, it's a locust, Motumba said as he stepped inside to get a drink of water. A locust? Yep, they're usually bigger than grasshoppers, he said between gulps of cool water. The ones in our fields are brown looking, and they fly as much as they jump. Luami's eyes were wide as her brother continued talking about the locust grasshoppers. She admired Motumba in many ways. He was the smartest boy around, and he treated her kindly. To her, he was the best brother any African girl could have. The bean field was doing nicely now. During the next few days, Motumba and the men watered the plants one more time, tenderly caring for their crop. Everyone was getting excited. In a matter of days, they would begin harvesting the beans, which were growing quite large on the vine, to sell in the markets. The beans could be picked green, or they could be allowed to dry on the vines before being picked and shelled. That evening, the family gathered at the front of the house to tell stories. A fire was lit as the moon came up, and Luami and Abina sang some folk songs to entertain the family. Father and grandfather talked about politics and the old colonial days when their country was run by the British. While the adults talked, little Abu found a grasshopper in the dark and brought it to his father and set it in his lap. "This is strange," Dansu laughed. "Mr. Grasshopper isn't even trying to get away. Maybe he's cold." "I think it's because he can't see," Motumba stated. "I read in school that grasshoppers have hundreds of eyes and they all reflect light, so at night they can't see. That's why he's not moving much." "And maybe he's afraid of the fire, too," Grandpa Manu said as he leaned forward and threw another stick of wood on the evening fire. The flames immediately began licking at the new timber. "It looks as if we're more afraid of him than he is of us," Dansu frowned as he stared down at the grasshopper. "When we came through town this morning, I heard some talk that the locusts are multiplying in greater numbers to the north. I hope they don't come this far south. That could mean disaster for all the farmers in the area." "I hope so too," Grandpa chimed in. "A plague of locusts is the worst thing one can possibly imagine this time of the year. War is bad and disease can be devastating, but grasshoppers are the scourge of northern Nigeria." He shivered even as the flames of the fire warmed the family. "If they grow too large in number and become a grasshopper plague, they could eat every green thing in sight." And with that, he launched into one of his lengthy explanations of what exactly a plague of locusts can do. "Tell us a story," Motumba offered, hoping to distract Grandpa Manu enough to tell them a story they hadn't heard in a long time. "So you want a story?" the old man asked. He squinted as if he were in deep thought. "All right, I've got just the one. I've been reading some of the questions in that book Mr. Cossi sold us, and then I got out the Bible to read some text, and wouldn't you know, I found a really good story. You'll never guess, oh dear, you'll never guess what it's about." Motumba's eyes grew bright in anticipation. "Let me guess. Grasshoppers?" "That's right." Grandpa smiled, a toothy grin in the flickering firelight. He paused and stared into the dancing flames for the longest while, and then he began the tale, slowly and deliberately. "This story happened a long, long time ago, when the earth was young. God's people had been slaves since forever, it seemed, and now God was delivering them from the clutches of the mighty Pharaoh of Egypt. God was punishing Pharaoh for not setting his people free. He turned the river to blood, sent frogs to cover the land, and even caused disease and hail to fall on their cattle. But still that stubborn old king would not listen. He would not obey God, so God sent another plague, and this time it was locusts, or grasshoppers, as we often call them. When the grasshoppers descended on Egypt, the sky grew dark and ominous. They made a hissing sound that roared as if a howling sandstorm was drawing close. The locusts landed on the grass and bushes and trees along the roads. They landed on the ripening fields of flax and barley that had been beaten to the ground by the hailstorm only a few days before. Worse still, the grasshoppers landed on the green fields of wheat and lentils that were still partly standing. It didn't seem to matter if a plant was growing or dead, green or dry. The old locusts ate everything in sight. They weighed down the grass and totally covered the palm trees. Everybody around the fire shuddered as they listened to the story. They had heard Grandpa tell his stories about grasshoppers, but they had never seen such a horrible sight with their own eyes. Luami and Motumba were totally transfixed by the story. Their mouths hung open and their eyes were big with wonder. Grandpa was one of the best storytellers around. So things came to life when he talked, and this story was no exception. He was really outdoing himself this time. And that's the end of the chapter. But I could read on for a couple minutes, or maybe now it's down to 1 minute. I think I will. Let's see because the story goes on. The swarming locust hordes looked like a big army of creeping, crawling creatures, Grandpa continued. The ground in Egypt was alive with the grasshoppers, and everyone ran here and there to get away from them, but they couldn't escape. The locusts crawled into their clothes and hair. Their prickly little legs scratched their skin and drove everyone crazy. There were just too many of them. Even the wells began to fill up with the squirming, crawling insects, making it impossible to get a drink of fresh water. But God's people were protected from the locusts. It was incredible. Not one grasshopper came to the land of Goshen where the Israelites lived. God took care of his people, and none of their crops were eaten. It was a miracle. Did the Bible really say all that? Luami asked, her eyes big. Well, I did add a few details, but then again, I've been through a plague of locusts before, so you really can't blame me now, child, can you? And that's the end of the story? Abina said sleepily as she yawned and picked up Abu where he was sleeping on a grass mat. It's time we all went to sleep. The beans will be ready to pick in just a few days, so we better get the rest while we can. And that's where I'll stop for tonight.